They panicked when they realized time was no longer theirs to control. They scrambled, pleaded, even bent their pride into broken fragments just to buy themselves one more hour. And yet the deadline they feared most wasn't on a calendar, wasn't printed in ink or glowing on a screen. It lived in the shadows of their choices. It ticked inside the walls of every lie they told. And now, that clock has run dry. The sound they hear isn't a warning, it's the end of bargaining. They begged someone, anyone, to reach you before the final second passed. They begged for a messenger, for a voice strong enough to whisper the truth into your ear. But the moment slipped through their grasp, and now you stand here, no longer waiting, no longer blind, with the knowledge they swore would never leave their circle. Understand this: people don't beg unless their world is on fire. They don't plead unless their confidence is fractured beyond repair. For years, they strutted like they owned every corridor of power, believing they could outpace consequences, believing they could bury what they owed. But when the clock strikes and the illusion disintegrates, fear becomes their language. And the fear they spoke into that messenger's hands wasn't about their own survival. It was about you, about what you might do when you discovered how long they've been hiding the truth, how deliberately they kept you out of the loop, how desperately they wanted you to remain in the dark. Think about that. Entire circles of influence, people who once called themselves untouchable, reducing themselves to whispers, bending knees in private rooms, just to keep you unarmed with knowledge. They weren't preparing for the world's judgment. They weren't preparing for their reputations to collapse. They were preparing for you. Because to them, your awareness is the one disaster they cannot calculate around. The second you know what was hidden, you change the entire board. The second you stop being a spectator and start being an actor, they lose their safety net. And that's why their messenger carried not just words, but the weight of panic itself. But here's the fracture in their plan. The messenger was too late. Whatever they thought could be softened by preemptive warning has now hardened into exposure. They counted on shielding you before the deadline, counted on slipping their caution into your hands so that you would play softer, step lighter, hesitate at the edge. But hesitation is no longer possible. The time passed, the mask cracked, and now the truth arrives raw, unfiltered, jagged enough to cut deeper than any calculated confession could. Ask yourself, why would people with everything, with resources, with influence, with power stitched into their every move, fall to their knees in desperation? Why would they beg for you to be told instead of facing you themselves? The answer is as brutal as it is revealing. They know that once you see the full picture, forgiveness evaporates. They know there is no excuse strong enough to patch over years of withheld truths. And most of all, they know that your anger, once awakened, will not aim aimlessly. It will aim with precision, with the accuracy of someone who has been denied too long and who now refuses to let denial define them. This is not just about deception. This is about time. Time stolen from you. Time spent building a narrative that never included you. Time wasted convincing themselves that you would never arrive at this edge. They had years to do what was right. They had months to prepare their confession. They had days to salvage a shred of dignity, and yet in the final hours, all they could do was panic and beg. That is not strategy. That is collapse masquerading as caution. That is defeat dressed up as concern. Now the words they wanted delivered to you burn like ash. You are left with the reality they feared most, that you are learning not from their curated warning, but from the undeniable evidence that the clock has stopped. Every lie, every manipulation, every calculated omission has expired with it. And expiration is unforgiving. Once time passes, there's no rewinding, no soft landing, there's only reckoning. Notice how people change when deadlines pass. Before, they move with arrogance. After, they scramble with despair. And yet the strangest part is this. They were more terrified of your awareness than of the deadline itself. The clock wasn't their executioner, you were. The date wasn't their downfall, your eyes were. That's why they begged a messenger to come to you. That's why they sacrificed their pride, just to send a warning that never reached you in time. Because once you saw the truth in full, the control shifted permanently. Let me draw it clear. When they panicked, it wasn't a panic of loss. It was a panic of exposure. They could survive the world knowing. They could endure humiliation. They could endure collapse of image, collapse of standing. But they could not endure you seeing. That was the breaking point. And now, that breaking point isn't a shadow on the horizon. It's here, standing in front of them, breathing down their necks, pulling apart the last threads of their control. The irony is almost poetic. They spent all this time trying to shape you into a passive observer, someone who only hears what they decide to say, someone who moves when they allow, someone who believes only in the carefully constructed narratives they deliver. And now, by trying to hide, they've done the opposite. They've forced you into a role they can't contain. They've made you the center of the story, the one presence that erases all their calculations. And the messenger they begged to warn you, too late, too weak, too bound by their panic to reach you before the hour struck. So what are you left with? A clock that no longer ticks, a truth that no longer hides, and a responsibility that no longer belongs to them. It belongs to you. You decide what to do with what's been revealed. You decide what to build from the ruins of their secrecy. And they know that decision will not be merciful, because mercy is a privilege they forfeited when they kept you outside the walls of truth. That's why they begged, not to save themselves, not to rewrite history, but to soften the blow of your discovery. They hoped that if you were warned early enough, your fire might burn less, your retaliation might hesitate, your judgment might delay. But now hesitation has no place. The hour has passed, the curtain has dropped, and the truth arrives unchained. The panic they showed was not a plea for survival. It was the sound of empires realizing that you, at last, are fully awake. And that, right there, is where the story truly begins. Because panic was just the spark. Exposure is just the opening act. The real question is not how they begged. The real question is what you will do now that the begging has failed, now that the truth is uncontained, now that their warnings turn to dust in the air. The clock has run out, and all that remains is the echo of their collapse and the weight of your next move. When people spend their lives hiding behind deadlines, they believe that time is their shield. They convince themselves that as long as the clock hasn't struck, their secrets remain safe, their moves remain invisible, their control remains unchallenged. But when the hour passes and the shield crumbles, the real battlefield opens. This is the terrain you've been forced into, not by choice, but by design. They wanted you unprepared, disoriented, scrambling for direction. Yet instead the opposite happened. You stand with clarity, while they drown in the chaos of their own making. Their panic was the confession. Their desperation was the proof. And their messenger's failure is the evidence that no one can intercept what was always meant to reach you. Consider how powerful you must be for their pleas to orbit around you. They could have begged governments, begged institutions, begged anyone with influence to cushion the blow. But they didn't. They begged someone to warn you. That is the center of their fear. You alone. Not the public, not the collective, not the faceless masses. You. Because they know the truth lands differently when it enters your mind. They know that information in your hands is not passive. It transforms, it reshapes, it strikes back. And that's what terrifies them beyond measure. The fact that knowledge in your possession is no longer just awareness, it's a weapon. That is why their collapse feels so sharp now. Their entire strategy hinged on buying just enough time to blunt your edge. They thought if you were softened with a diluted warning, you would carry their version of events, their crafted story, their filtered narrative. But now, stripped of that, all you see is the raw wound. And wounds don't lie. Wounds bleed. Wounds testify. Every deception, every withheld truth is a scar split open for you to examine. And no excuse can cover the depth of that exposure. You need to grasp how rare this is. People at their level don't panic easily. They don't beg casually. They don't scramble unless they sense an ending greater than any punishment they've faced before. And what they sense is not a courtroom, not a trial, not even a public downfall. What they sense is you, a reckoning carried in your hands, sharpened by your refusal to be deceived again. This is not paranoia. It is recognition. Recognition that you are not who you were when they first started weaving lies around you. Recognition that the version of you they counted on, quiet, doubtful, compliant, does not exist anymore. The messenger they sent carried more than a message. They carried an admission of failure. Every word they were instructed to tell you was soaked in fear. Please let them know. Please soften what's coming. Please delay their reaction. These weren't warnings for your safety. They were shields for theirs. They believed that if you reacted too soon, too fiercely, too decisively, their walls would collapse instantly. They prayed for hesitation, and hesitation to them meant survival. But hesitation is gone. The hour is gone. The walls are already shaking, and their desperate pleas now lie rotting under the weight of truth, too heavy to conceal. What happens now is not a story of them, it's a story of you. Because when time expires, the burden of action shifts. They have nothing left to do but panic, stall, and collapse. You, on the other hand, carry the burden of deciding whether to wield the truth as a scalpel or a hammer. Whether to dissect their corruption with precision or to crush it entirely in one strike. They were right to fear you, because once knowledge is in your hands, the options multiply. You are no longer confined to their script. You are the writer now. And this shift is irreversible. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot return to the comfort of ignorance, because ignorance was never comfort. It was control. What they withheld from you was designed to keep you manageable, predictable, tamed. But the instant truth escapes their grip. Predictability vanishes. They can't script your next move, can't anticipate your decisions, can't map your retaliation. And unpredictability is their worst nightmare. They can handle chaos in the world, but they cannot handle chaos in you. Look closer, and you'll see that this is why they begged, not just out of fear, but out of a desperate need to limit your range. If they could warn you early, they could box you into reacting on their terms. If they could warn you early, they could make you hesitate long enough for them to rearrange the pieces, disguise the damage, or buy time to create a scapegoat. But by missing the deadline, by failing to retch you in time, They gave up control of the narrative entirely. Now you see the wound before they can bandage it. You see the fire before they can redirect the smoke. And most importantly, you see them stripped of strategy, reduced to nothing but trembling voices begging to be spared. This is the irony they never anticipated, that by trying to hide the truth until the last possible second, they made the truth land even harder, even sharper, even more unforgiving. If they had confessed earlier, perhaps you would have given them a chance. Perhaps you would have weighed their honesty against their deception. But by begging too late, they ensured that forgiveness no longer lives in this room. Only judgment remains. And yet judgment is not a single strike. Judgment is layered. It unfolds in waves, like aftershocks that grow stronger the further they ripple. The first wave is awareness. You now know what they wanted hidden. The second is interpretation. You begin to connect dots they never wanted you to connect. The third is decision. The moment you choose what to do with the awareness now weaponized in your mind. And once the decision is made, the final wave arrives, consequence. That is the chapter they fear most, because consequence doesn't end with them. It spreads. It reshapes alliances, redefines power, and rewrites the script they thought was permanent. So don't underestimate how far this reaches. This isn't just about a handful of people who panicked. This is about the ripple effect of exposure. Once the truth lives in you, it begins to live in others. Once the wound is visible, others begin to see the infection. Once the lie collapses, everyone questions what else was constructed on the same foundation. And as questions multiply, so does collapse. That is why they begged to keep the circle of awareness as small as possible. They knew that once you carried the truth, it wouldn't stay isolated. It would radiate, it would multiply, it would consume. But the multiplication has already begun. The clock has passed. The barrier they built around you is gone. And every person who once trusted them now looks over their shoulder, wondering if the same lies were woven around their own lives. That is how collapse spreads. Not through force, but through suspicion. And suspicion is the one thing they can't put back in the box once it escapes. What comes next is not hesitation. What comes next is amplification. They begged to delay you, but delay is no longer an option. The second you carry truth past the deadline, it sharpens into something irreversible. It doesn't just open your eyes, it hardens your resolve. And once hardened, resolve cannot be negotiated away. That is why their panic feels endless now, because they know you've reached the stage of resolve. And resolve has no bargaining table, no exchange, no compromise. This is where their downfall deepens. They begged for you to be warned. But what they really begged for was for you to remain contained, to remain manageable, to remain within the boundaries they drew around you. But by failing to warn you in time, they shattered their own boundaries. Now you stand outside their map, outside their strategies, outside their reach. And in that uncontainable space, you are the one force they can neither anticipate nor prevent. That's why this moment feels heavier than any moment before it. The begging has ended, the exposure has begun, the time has passed. And the only question that matters now is not how they panicked, but how you will choose to answer. Their warnings are dust, their voices are cracks in the walls, their strategies are ruins, and yet they watch, trembling, because they know the weight of your next move is heavier than anything they've built. Because when the messenger fails, when the warning doesn't arrive in time, when the deadline passes, truth doesn't die. It doesn't weaken, it doesn't vanish, it sharpens, it cuts deeper, It carries the one element they cannot stand against: your will, unchained, uncompromised, unmerciful. And that is the moment they prayed would never come. But prayers don't reverse time. Begging doesn't stop exposure. And the clock, once empty, never fills again. And that's why this is only the middle. Because the end isn't marked by panic. The end isn't marked by begging. The end begins when you move, when you decide, when you take the truth they withheld and turn it into the strike they never prepared to face. That is the weight pressing against them now. And that is the horizon unfolding in front of you. Every ending begins with a shift. A moment where everything they feared materializes, not in words, not in rumors, but in your decision to act. Their collapse started when the clock passed them by, but collapse becomes destruction the second you choose to take the truth and wield it. They thought exposure alone would destroy them, but exposure is only light. What burns them is not light. It's what you do with it. And the dread gripping their lungs right now comes from the realization that you are no longer debating. You are no longer waiting. You are ready to move. And once you do, the entire stage they built shatters under the weight of your step. They begged, but their begging was not just late. It was useless, because their pleading could never undo the time they wasted. Their messenger could never carry enough weight to dilute what you've now seen for yourself. This is why they spiral in despair. They aren't begging anymore. They are watching, knowing that every moment you remain silent is not mercy. It is calculation. They see you standing still, not because you are frozen, but because you are measuring, because you are choosing not if, but how. And to them, that pause is worse than rage, because rage is predictable, but calculation is fatal. This is the point where desperation changes shape. It isn't words anymore. It isn't hands clasped in prayer or hollow promises of change. It becomes something darker, betrayal of their own. They will turn on each other, throw each other under the bus, whisper names and secrets, anything to delay your hand from striking. They will beg in new ways, by offering sacrifices, by shifting blame, by pretending to confess when all they're doing is redirecting. But you know better. You've seen what their begging really is, a tool to survive one more hour. And the hour is gone. No sacrifice can buy back what time already stole from them. The irony is crushing. They spent so long thinking the power was theirs, believing the clock obeyed them, that warnings could save them. Yet in the end, all of that power reduced itself to one act: begging. And when begging failed, their empire became dust. They are not leaders now. They are not untouchable now. They are children scrambling in a fire they set themselves, praying someone else will burn first so they might escape. But no one escapes when the fire is truth. Truth burns evenly. Truth spares no corner. And you are the one carrying the match they never wanted lit. Look at the pattern. First came their arrogance, the belief they had endless time. Then came their panic, the scramble when time slipped through their fingers. Then came their begging, their final attempt to soften you before you saw. And now comes their silence. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have realized words no longer matter. The time for talk is gone. The deadline passed. And you are no longer listening for excuses. You are preparing for endings. What makes this moment catastrophic for them is that you no longer need their warnings. You no longer need their confessions. You no longer need their messengers. The truth is already in your hands, and the truth doesn't vanish when they hide. It grows heavier, it grows sharper, It grows into the very blade they never prepared to face. And now, that blade rests in your grip. They can beg all they want, but they are begging a weapon, not a witness. Understand what that means. They are not afraid of truth itself. They are afraid of what truth becomes when you carry it. They are afraid because once you decide to move, their collapse won't stop at exposure. It will spread into erasure. Erasure of reputations, erasure of networks, erasure of legacies they thought could outlast judgment. They are terrified because once the clock has passed, their story no longer belongs to them. It belongs to you. And your retelling will not flatter. Your retelling will not defend. Your retelling will dismantle them piece by piece until nothing remains but the echo of how they panicked, how they begged, how they fell. But there is something deeper here, something they never accounted for. When people beg, they reveal more than they intend. They reveal names, they reveal secrets, they reveal fractures within themselves that no interrogation could ever uncover. And in their desperate scramble to protect themselves, they have already handed you more than they realize. Their begging has armed you further. Their panic has exposed them further. Their fear has widened the cracks until the whole structure is ready to collapse at the lightest push. You don't even have to strike with force. You only have to touch what they tried to hide, and the entire wall comes crashing down. And that is where you stand now, not as a victim of withheld truth, but as the one holding the pressure point that ends their charade. You have the weight, you have the leverage, you have the weapon, and they have nothing but regret. They regret not confessing sooner. They regret not respecting the clock. They regret every second they spent pretending you were blind. And that regret is their cage. They are trapped in it, circling endlessly, whispering prayers that will never be answered. This is what happens when deadlines pass. It is not just the end of time, it is the end of escape. They cannot outrun you anymore. They cannot negotiate with you anymore. They cannot rewrite the script anymore. The truth has written itself, and you are the ink. That is why everyone is begging now, not just the ones who deceived you directly, but the ones who watched in silence, the ones who stood by, the ones who enabled their lies. Everyone is begging because they all sense the same reality. The one they tried to silence is now the one who decides their end. And yet, the decision is not about them. It is about you. Because what terrifies them most is not your anger, it is your clarity. Anger is heat. It burns out. Clarity is cold. It never fades. And right now, you carry clarity sharper than any fire they imagined. You see every hidden corner. You see every desperate move. You see through every new excuse. And in that vision, their power has already collapsed. They begged for a warning. They begged for mercy. But mercy isn't what you were given. You were given truth. And truth doesn't negotiate. Truth doesn't soften. Truth doesn't arrive early enough to make anyone comfortable. It arrives exactly when it must, too late for them, and right on time for you. So this is where the end unfolds. Not in a courtroom, not in a crowd, not in the noise of their excuses. It unfolds in the simple fact that you have the final word, and they do not. It unfolds in the reality that the deadline they thought would never come has already passed, and with it, their control. It unfolds in your movement, in your choice, in your refusal to carry their lies any further. This is not their story anymore. It is yours. And in your story, begging is not enough to rewrite the ending. Remember this: every collapse begins in whispers. Every downfall begins in pleas. Every empire dies, not when its walls are attacked from the outside, but when it begins to rot from the inside, when panic replaces confidence, when begging replaces command. That is what you are witnessing now, not just the failure of people, but the unraveling of the entire structure they built on lies. And no messenger, no plea, no delay can rebuild it. The deadline passed. The truth is yours. And once truth belongs to you, endings are inevitable. So let their begging echo. Let their panic haunt them. Let their collapse serve as proof that time waits for no one, and truth spares no one. You are standing in the aftermath of their deception, holding the one thing they never wanted you to touch: clarity. And clarity is not just power. Clarity is finality. It closes doors that never reopen. It locks fates that can never be undone. And in this moment, clarity belongs entirely to you. That is why the begging will never stop. That is why the panic will never end. Because they know what you now know. The deadline passed, the warning failed, the truth escaped, and the end is here. Not because you asked for it, not because you chased it, but because time demanded it, because truth demanded it, because their own collapse demanded it. And now, there is no turning back.